Old man, hurry up!
Under the blistering sun of rural Nigeria, where the earth is cracked open as if it has never known a single drop of water, a scene unfolds that leaves anyone who passes by completely stunned. An old man, his back bent nearly in half, his trembling legs sinking into the dry, hardened soil. A rough rope is tied tightly around his neck, connected directly to a heavy plow dragging behind him. He is being forced to pull the plow like an ox. Every step is a silent scream of pain. Every breath is a struggle he barely survives. And behind him is his own son, a young man well-dressed, holding a leather whip, his eyes cold as stone. Move faster. Do you think you are still young? Crack. The whip slices through the air. The old man's back jerks, but he dares not stop. The entire field falls silent. Villagers stand at a distance watching. But no one dares to speak, because that son is now the richest man in the region. No one dares to challenge money. No one dares to stand up for a weak old man who has been turned into nothing more than a tool by his own flesh and blood. But what few people know is, that very old man once sold bags of corn in the market, went hungry, went without, just to raise that same son into the man he has become. And no one could have imagined that the day he was treated like an animal would be the day fate began to turn everything upside down. If you're rewatching this video right now, take just a second to think. When a person has everything but loses gratitude, what do they really have left? Hello, I'm sharing this story from a small corner of New Jersey, a place where family values are still held sacred. If you believe that parents deserve love, not cruelty, please subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss more stories that truly touch the heart. And stay until the very end, because the story you're about to hear is not just about cruelty, but about the price one must pay for forgetting where they came from. Few people in that dry, sun-scorched village could remember exactly when it all began. They only remembered that there was once a time when, every morning before the sun had even risen above the palm trees, a thin man named Baba Chinadu would wake up early, quietly light a fire, boil a pot of thin porridge, and then carry his hoe out to the fields while the night dew still clung to the ground. He didn't own much land. His soil was poor, the harvest uncertain, but inside that small mud house, he carried a dream far greater than the cracked fields stretching before him. That dream was his son. The boy's name was Abina. When Abina was little, he was skinny, bright-eyed, running barefoot around the yard. He would cling to his father's legs and ask innocent questions about the world beyond their village. He asked why some children could go to school in the city, why some people wore white shirts, shiny leather shoes, and carried briefcases onto buses. He asked whether a child born among red dust and dry fields could ever change his fate. Each time, Baba Chinadu would gently rub his son's head, his rough hands moving slowly over the boy's sweat-damp curls, and say in a voice firm enough to carve itself into the air, "You will not live like me. You will go to school. You will leave this field behind." That was not comfort. To him, it was a vow. From that day on, Baba Chinadu's entire life revolved around one thing: making sure Abina could go to school, continue his education, and escape the poverty that had clung to their family for generations. He sold his first harvest of corn instead of keeping it for food. He took the few hens they owned, the most valuable things in their yard, to the market to trade for old books. When prices dropped, he worked on distant farms, carrying cassava sacks and bundles of firewood, trading sweat for a few small coins. There were days he returned home with his back aching so badly he could barely bend. His feet split open, bleeding into the dry soil. But at night, when Abina sat under the dim oil lamp sounding out words, Baba Chinadu would sit quietly in the corner, watching his son as if that faint light was illuminating his entire life. Abina's mother had died early. From that day on, he became both father and mother. He learned to mend clothes, to cook what little food they had so the child would still feel full, and even to hide his exhaustion whenever his son asked, "Are you okay, father?" He always smiled, "I'm fine. As long as you study well, I'll always be fine." But the truth was, there were nights when, after Abina had fallen asleep, Baba Chinadu would step outside, sit alone on a rickety wooden chair, clutch his chest and cough from sheer exhaustion. The cough echoed into the darkness, dry and hollow, like the sound of earth cracking in drought. He would look up at the vast black sky, his eyes red from dust and sleeplessness, and whisper as if speaking to his late wife, "No matter what, I will give our son a different path." When Abina turned 12, The village school announced an additional fee if he wanted to continue to the next level. For the wealthy, it was the cost of a meal. For Baba Chinadu, it was a weight crushing his chest. He didn't sleep for 2 nights. On the third morning, the villagers saw him leading his only cow to the market. That cow had been his last hope for plowing the next season. A neighbor grabbed his arm in shock. Chinidu, if you sell it, how will you farm? He only looked toward the school gate at the end of the dusty road, where his son stood waiting, clutching a worn-out school bag. His answer was calm, painfully calm. I can plow with my own hands, but his future cannot wait. People at the market said Baba Chindu barely bargained. He sold it for less than it was worth, afraid of missing the tuition deadline. When he held the crumpled bills in his hands, he didn't smile, didn't speak, just quietly walked home. That afternoon, Abina's school fees were paid. The boy threw his arms around his father, his eyes shining as if he had just been handed the whole sky. One day I'll buy you 10 cows, Abina said, his young voice full of determination. I'll build you a big house. You won't suffer anymore. Baba Chinadu laughed, a rare laugh that softened the weathered lines of his face. I don't need 10 cows, he said. I only need one thing, that one day you will remember this. But life has a strange way of working. Promises made in poverty are often sincere, while memories in wealth are often fragile. In the years that followed, Obina grew quickly. He excelled in school, earned the respect of his teachers, and eventually received a scholarship to study in the city. The entire village buzzed with excitement. People came to congratulate Baba Chinadu. Some said he had suffered, but he was blessed. Others clapped his shoulder and laughed, saying he would one day be the father of a great man. On the day Abina left for the city, Baba Chinadu wore the best clothes he had. They were faded with age, but he had washed them carefully the night before. At the bus station, amid clouds of red dust, he pressed a small cloth bag into his son's hands. Inside were a few homemade snacks and the little money he had saved. Take this, he said. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine here. Abina hugged him tightly. That day, he cried, I promise I'll come back. I promise I'll make you proud. Baba Chinadu nodded. But when the bus drove away, it was he who could not hold back his tears. He stood on that dusty road, watching until the bus became nothing more than a dot on the horizon. The wind whipped his shirt, but he stayed there a long time, as if a piece of his heart had left the village with his son. And then, the years passed. At first, Abina wrote letters home, awkward but warm, telling stories of lecture halls, bright electric lights, crowded streets, and opportunities he had never dreamed of back in the village. Each time a letter arrived, Baba Chinadu would ask someone to read it aloud again and again until he memorized every word. Then he would fold it carefully and place it in a small wooden box beside where he slept, like a treasured possession. Then the letters became less frequent, then shorter, then turned into occasional messages sent through acquaintances. I'm busy. I'm working. I'll come back later. Baba Chinadu kept waiting. He always waited. Every holiday, he repaired the roof, swept the yard clean, and looked toward the village entrance whenever he heard the distant sound of a vehicle. He imagined the day his son would return in fine clothes, stepping out of a car under admiring eyes, embracing him and saying, Father, I made it. You don't have to suffer anymore. And one day that day finally came. But what returned with Abina was not only wealth, it was also distance. The boy who once ran barefoot in the fields now stepped out of a gleaming car in polished leather shoes, a shining watch on his wrist, and the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne. Villagers gathered, whispering in admiration. Obina smiled, shook hands with the village chief, handed out money to children, speaking words that sounded like a fresh wind blowing through old land. Baba Chinadu stood at the doorway, his eyes wet with joy. He had waited for this moment for so long. He stepped forward, hands trembling with emotion, ready to embrace his son just like the day he sent him away. But Abina paused just for a brief moment. Then he leaned in slightly, hugging his father in a stiff, distant way, as if afraid his expensive clothes might touch the dust on the old man's worn shirt. In that single moment, something very small but very cold quietly fell between them. Baba Chinadu still smiled. He told himself maybe his son was just tired. Maybe the city had changed him a little. Maybe after a few days at home, Abina would become the same boy again. He didn't realize that sometimes what changes in a person isn't their clothes, their car, or even their voice. It's their heart. And once the heart has changed, even the person who sacrificed everything for them can become nothing more memory they would rather hide. After the day, Abina returned to the village to the sound of admiration and whispers. Baba Chinadu had once deceived himself into believing everything would be all right. He thought the coldness in his son was just dust from the city still clinging to his soul. He believed that a few shared meals, a few quiet afternoons on the porch, a few old stories about their days of hardship would bring back the boy who once clung to his legs and cried at the bus station. But Baba Chinadu was wrong. What returned from the city was not just a successful man. It was pride shame toward the past and a cruelty that grew silently day by day. At first, Abina only changed the way he spoke. He no longer sat with his father under the low roof to eat. He had the house renovated, built a fence, replaced the old wooden doors with iron ones, and began looking at everything old around him as if it were a stain to be hidden. He rarely called him father in front of guests. Whenever villagers or business partners from town came by, Obina kept Baba Chinadu out of sight like an old object unfit to be displayed in a new home. Then one morning, everything began. It was still before sunrise. A thin layer of mist covered the ground. The rooster behind the house had just crowed when Baba Chinadu's door was kicked open. Abina stood there, his tall frame blocking the doorway, his voice cold as metal. "Get up." Baba Chinadu blinked, confused. "Get up and go to the field." The worker quit. "Today you pull the plow." He sat up, thinking he had misheard. For a brief second, he even thought his son was just angry about losing labor. But when he stepped outside and saw the wooden plow already placed under the tree, the rope coiled beside it, and the unwavering look in Abina's eyes, he understood. This was not anger, it was an order. Abina's voice cracked, not finishing the sentence. His son cut him off immediately. "Don't start with that weak tone. I've given you a place to stay. You need to work." The word father had disappeared from his mouth, as if it had never existed. But to Baba Chinadu, its absence fell as heavy as stone. Out in the field, the ground was still damp with dew, but it promised a scorching day ahead. The early wind passed over the long rows of soil, but it carried no kindness. Obina dragged out the old wooden yoke, the same one, once used for the cow Baba Chinadu had sold to pay for his education. The irony was unbearable. The very tool that had been sacrificed for Abina's future had now returned to be placed upon the body of the man who gave up everything. Bend down. Baba Chinadu stood still. He looked at the yoke, at the rope, then at his son. In his eyes was not only pain, but a deep, chilling confusion, as if he still could not believe that the child who once slept in his arms could now look at him like an animal. "Bend down," Abina shouted louder. The old man's hands trembled. Slowly he bent. The rough wood pressed onto his shoulders, heavy and unforgiving like a sentence being passed. The rope wrapped around his neck, tightening not enough to choke him immediately, but enough to burn with every swallow. On that first morning, Baba Chinadu still tried to preserve what little dignity he had left. He walked slowly but as upright as he could. Each step that dragged the plow through the soil sent waves of pain from his shoulders down his spine, from his knees up to his chest. Behind him, Abina held the plow handle, calm like a farmer guiding livestock. "Keep it straight." Baba adjusted his steps. "Faster." He clenched his teeth.
"You were useless!"
The words cut like a thin blade, no blood drawn on the outside, but deep wounds where no one could see. In the days that followed, it became routine. A cruel routine, repeated as steadily as the rising sun. Every morning, before the village fully woke, Baba Chinadu was dragged from his bed. No explanations, no arguments. Only the sound of doors flung open, footsteps on dirt, the dry knock of wooden yokes, and Abina's cold voice. Some days were cloudy, some scorching, some filled with dust stinging the eyes, but all were the same in one way. The old father always bowed his head and pulled the plow for his own son. The villagers knew. How could they not? The field lay beside the main path. Women carrying water saw it. Children herding goats saw it. Old men sitting beneath the Iroko tree at the edge of the village saw it. They saw Baba Chinadu's sinus trembling shoulders beneath the yoke, his aged feet sinking into mud or pressing into cracked earth, sweat running down his wrinkled face, and Abina standing behind him like a merciless overseer. But no one spoke. Abina was now the richest man around. He lent money, bought land, sponsored festivals, repaired the village hall, and had connections in town. In places where money speaks louder than conscience, silence comes quickly. There were sympathetic glances. Quiet sighs swallowed before they could escape. But in the end, no one stepped forward. And so the cruelty continued day after day under the open sky, as if it had become a new law. Baba Chinadu's body began to change. His shoulders bruised and swollen beneath his worn shirt. The skin around his neck chafed raw, sometimes bleeding. His hands, already calloused now, trembled so much he could barely hold a bowl of water. Each night, his knees burned as if fire lived inside them. Some evenings, he could barely stand without leaning on the wall. Food sat in front of him untouched for long moments before he forced himself to swallow a few bites. Yet even when breathing became painful the next morning, he was still dragged out again. One day, when Baba Chinadu stumbled and nearly collapsed between the rows, a passing woman stopped. She gripped her basket tightly. Her eyes reddened. "Abina," she said softly, almost afraid of her own voice. "No matter what, that is your father." Abina turned. His gaze was sharp as a blade. "This is my family's business." The woman fell silent. She walked away quickly, her head lowered. From that moment on, no one dared try again. But the deepest pain was not the yoke nor the rope nor the cold commands. The deepest pain was that Baba Chindu still loved his son. Every night, after dragging himself back to his small room, he would sit for a long time under the flickering oil lamp. Sometimes he touched the marks on his neck, then closed his eyes as if asking himself where he had gone wrong. He had fed his son, educated him, starved so the boy could eat, sold his cow, his chickens, and half his life's strength so his son could escape poverty. He had believed that as long as his son succeeded, every sacrifice was worth it. And now, in the house built from his dreams, he lived like a condemned man. Many nights, Baba Chinadu heard Abina laughing in the living room with guests. His voice rang out confidently, full of the pride of a man praised by the world. In those moments, Baba sat in the dark, back against the wall, eyes wide open. He did not cry out loud. The pain of old fathers rarely has the strength to become sound. It simply sinks, settling in the eyes, the chest, the heavy breaths. Then the dry season reached its peak. The sun hung over the field like a burning plate of fire. The air was thick, so hot it burned to breathe. The ground cracked open, sharp enough to cut bare feet. That day, Obina seemed especially irritable. Some shipment had been delayed. He came to the field earlier than usual, his face dark, every movement filled with violence. Baba Chinadu felt dizzy the moment he stepped outside. The night before, he hadn't slept because of the pain along his spine. His chest felt heavy, his head buzzed like something was burning inside. But Abina didn't see it, or did he care. The yoke went onto his shoulders. The rope tightened around his neck. "Move." Baba Chinadu stepped forward. One step, then another. The plow felt heavier than ever. Each time its blade cut into the hardened earth, his whole body jolted, sweat stung his eyes. His breathing grew shallow, his vision blurred, the long rows of soil melting into streaks of shadow and light. "Keep it straight," Abina shouted. He tried. Faster. He clenched his teeth, his cracked lips bleeding. "You were useless." This time, Baba Chinadu could respond. His knees trembled violently. A sharp pain shot from his chest to his temples. His ears rang. He forced himself to take another step, then another, as if enduring just a little longer would somehow get him through the day. But his aged body had reached its limit. Suddenly, his foot slipped. The plow veered off. His entire body collapsed forward. He fell to the ground. Not the slow fall of someone losing balance, but the total collapse of a body worn down too long, burdened too long, silent for too long. His face hit the burning earth. Red dust rose around his frail body. The yoke still pressed on his shoulders. The rope still tightened around his neck. His hands clawed weakly at the ground as if trying to push himself up, but his arms no longer obeyed. Behind him, Abina froze. The field fell completely silent. The wind stopped. Even the birds in the distant trees seemed to vanish. Baba Chinadu lay there, his breath broken, so faint it was almost impossible to tell whether his chest still rose at all. And in that very moment, as the old father collapsed, in the middle of the field, the fate of everyone involved began to shift in a different direction. For the first few seconds after Baba Chinadu collapsed, the entire field seemed frozen in a suffocating silence. The ground burned beneath the blazing midday sun. Red dust hung in the air, not yet settled. The plow had been dragged off to one side, its blade lodged halfway into the hardened soil, while Baba Chinadu's frail body lay sprawled in front of it, his shoulders still pinned beneath the rough wooden yoke, his neck still caught in the rope that had tightened hard enough to leave dark bruises on his skin. His breathing was weak and broken. Each slight rise of his chest looked like it took all the strength he had left just to hold on to the little life still remaining in his worn-out body. Everyone watching from a distance understood one thing clearly. The old man no longer had the strength to stand up, but Abina did not see it the way they did. In his eyes there was no pity, no panic, Not even the confusion of a man watching his own father collapse. The only thing written across his face was fury, because the furrow had been left unfinished, because the work had been interrupted, because the tool in front of him was no longer functioning the way he wanted. He stood still for only a brief second. Then he stepped forward, one step at a time, fast and hard, crushing the dry cracked patches of earth beneath his feet. "You're pretending, aren't you?" His voice cut across the field like a blade. Baba Chindu did not answer. He no longer had enough breath to answer. His cracked lips parted slightly as if trying to draw in air, but his throat burned too badly to make a sound. His eyes remained shut, his brows tightened in pain. One thin hand trembled weakly against the dirt, as if trying to find support, but then it fell helplessly back down. Abina saw that movement, and instead of recognizing the desperation of a collapsing body, he took it as silent defiance. "Get up!" The shout cracked like a whip. Still no response. And then, before the horrified eyes of a few villagers standing far away, Abina kicked his father. The kick was not high, but it was strong enough to jerk Baba Chinadu's frail body to one side. The yoke struck the ground with a dry, hollow thud. A groan escaped the old man's mouth, small, rough, and broken like the final sound of someone who had endured too much for too long. "Get up!" Abina screamed again. "You are not allowed to rest." He bent down, grabbed the rope attached to the plow, and jerked it backward with force, as if pulling a little harder would make the old man move again. He did not know, or did not want to know, that there are limits in life which, once reached, no command has the power to push any farther. Baba Chinadu remained there, no resistance, no pleading, no attempt to rise. For the first time after so many days of being driven into the fields like an animal, he lay completely motionless before his son's brutality, not because he had chosen silence anymore, but because his body had nothing left to give in response. Abina's anger flared even higher. It was no longer ordinary irritation. It was the rage of a man used to controlling everything, suddenly forced to face the truth that some things cannot be bent by money, shouting, or violence. For men like him, helplessness is what drives them mad. He tightened his grip on the rope. The veins in his hands stood out beneath his sun-darkened skin. "Fine," he hissed through clenched teeth. "If you want to get up on your own, I will drag you up." A hot gust of wind crossed the field. That patch of ground was not completely dry like the others. Earlier that morning, a corner of the field near the irrigation ditch had held a thin layer of damp mud beneath the surface, baked over by the sun until it looked dry. At a glance, no one would have guessed it was slick enough to be dangerous. Abina didn't notice. Rage had clouded his eyes. In his mind, there was only one thought: lift the plow, drag the old man up, and force everything back into the order he had created. He yanked hard. The plow jerked free from the furrow. He stepped backward to brace himself. His right foot landed on the thin layer of mud, and in that instant, everything happened too quickly for anyone to cry out. His heel slid sideways. His body lost balance. All his weight crashed to one side while his hand still gripped the rope. Then a dry, sickening sound cracked through the stillness. Crack. It was not as loud as thunder, not as violent as a falling tree, but it was sharp, clear, and horrifying enough to send a chill through everyone standing nearby. And then came the scream. A scream tore across the field. Not Baba Chinadu's wary groan, but Abina's. He crashed to the ground, his body slamming hard against the edge of the ridge. The rope flew from his hand. The plow tipped over. Mud splattered across his expensive clothes. One of his legs twisted beneath him at a grotesque angle, the lower pant leg quickly stained, while the face that had always been proud and cold now twisted in unbearable pain. "Ah!" His scream echoed across the rows of earth, all the way to the edge of the village. He tried to push himself up, but the moment he moved, the pain shot from his leg to his chest so fiercely he nearly blacked out. He looked down at his leg, and for the first time in many years, real fear appeared in his eyes. His leg was broken, not scraped, not lightly sprained, but truly broken, a brutal, undeniable injury. He tried to move again. The sharp agony made his whole body curl in on itself. He could not stand. He could not walk. He could not do the simplest thing that only moments earlier he had been ordering someone else to do. The villagers in the distance finally began to run toward him. At first, it was only two goat-herding children rushing back toward the village in panic. Then a few men nearby abandoned their work and hurried across the plots. An old woman walking past the canal dropped her basket, covering her mouth when she saw what had happened. Abina lay there in the mud, his face twisted in pain, cold sweat breaking across his forehead, and Baba Chinidu, he was still lying there, only a few steps away. Still hurting, still exhausted, still marked by dark bruises around his neck, raw abrasions on his shoulders, and hands trembling with a weariness deep in his bones. But, for the first time in so many days that had felt like hell, he was not being beaten. There was no shout ordering him to get up, no whip striking his back, no hand yanking the rope tighter around his neck. Through the haze of his own pain, Baba Chinadu opened his eyes slightly. His vision was blurred, but still clear enough to see his son writhing on the ground, helpless for the first time, just as he himself had been helpless through so many mornings. A strange expression passed across the old man's face. It was not joy, not satisfaction, not hatred. Only a deep, silent stillness, as if he had just watched the wheel of fate turn once, and no one could stop it. One of the village men arrived first. He knelt beside Abina and reached toward his leg, but Abina screamed the moment he touched it. "Don't touch me," but the aggression in his voice now sounded weaker, stripped of the power that once made others afraid. It was only the reflex of a man trying to cling to the last scraps of control, while his own body had already betrayed him. Another man bent down and removed the yoke from Baba Chinadua's shoulders. When the heavy block of wood was lifted away, the old man gasped, his eyes closing tightly, as if the mere release from that burden was already too great to believe. The rope around his neck was loosened. The skin beneath it was bruised and torn. The man looking at the wounds froze, his hands suspended in the air, as if he did not know whether to feel anger, sorrow, or shame on behalf of the entire village that had remained silent for far too long. "My God," a woman whispered behind them. "He was tortured this badly." Those words tore something open. Everything people had seen and tried to ignore, everything they had known and been too afraid to name, suddenly stood exposed under the merciless midday sun. There was no hiding it anymore, no pretending it was just a family matter. An old father had been turned into a beast of burden in the middle of the field. And the very man who now lay helpless, unable to stand on his own. Abina clenched his teeth, trying to endure the pain, his eyes darting around for the thing that had always saved him before. Fear in other people's faces, obedience lowered heads. But today, what he found was different. Some looked shocked. Some looked pitying. Some looked horrified. And some looked at him with quiet judgment. For the first time, Abina was no longer the man standing behind the plow with power in his hands. For the first time, he was the one lying in the dirt, dependent on the hands of the very people he had always thought himself above. An ox cart was called from the edge of the village. People carefully lifted him onto it, and every movement made him cry out in pain. His legs swelled so quickly that anyone could see the injury was severe. He clutched the side of the cart, sweat and dust streaking his face, his usual polished appearance stripped away, leaving only a man terrified of his own pain. Meanwhile, Baba Chinadu was helped into a sitting position beneath the scant shade of a tree near the field's edge. He was still very weak. His thin shoulders trembled with each breath. An old woman brought him water, her hands shaking as she placed the bowl into his. He held it with trembling fingers and drank in small sips like a man who had just returned from very far away. He did not ask whether his son was all right. He did not utter a single word of blame. His silence in that moment was heavier than any condemnation. Because sometimes, after too much suffering, a person no longer has the strength left to accuse. They only have enough strength left to survive. The ox cart rolled slowly away from the field, carrying Abina and the sound of his painful groans. The crowd gradually scattered, but not before each of them turned back one more time to look at Baba Chinadu. The old father sat beneath the tree, hunched over, his neck marked by deep rope bruises, his shoulders dark with swelling, his hollow face mottled by broken sunlight, like living evidence of the cruelty the entire village had witnessed. And it was in that fateful midday that a truth began to emerge, like the first crack in a wall once thought unbreakable. The man who had forced another person to pull a plow in his place could no longer stand on his own legs. And the old father, who seemed to have nothing left but pain and humiliation, had, for the first time in many months, been given a moment of quiet that was not torn apart by blows. But that was not the end. The accident was only the first break, because when a man who is used to tormenting others is suddenly made to taste helplessness in his own body, life rarely stops at the sound of one bone snapping. It usually has much longer, heavier, and far more bitter days waiting ahead. After the accident in the field that day, Abina no longer walked the way he once had. People carried him home through his cries of pain, then took him to a clinic in town. His leg was badly broken. The doctor said he would have to remain bedridden for a long time before he could even begin learning to walk properly again. And even if he recovered, that leg would never be as strong as it used to be. For a man who had once strode proudly through the village basking in admiration, that news was like a hammer blow straight to the deepest part of his pride. In the first few days, Abina still lived off the remnants of his old power. He lay on a wide bed in the coolest room of the house, his leg bound in splints, his face twisted in discomfort, barking orders at anyone who passed by. He sent people for water, for medicine, for food. He summoned the field manager to give instructions. He pressured the men who had once flattered him to go work the land in his place. But life has a cold rule. Once the money starts slowing down, people start backing away. The laborers who had followed him for good wages now heard that their master had been crippled, and with the entire village whispering about what he had done to his father, they began to disappear one by one. One claimed his mother was sick. Another said he had to go be with his wife after childbirth. Some never even bothered to return. The relationships he had thought were solid turned out to be tied together by money alone, and the money was no longer flowing the way it once had. The accident came just when the planting season needed to begin. That was the real blow. A field cannot plow itself. Seeds cannot plant themselves. If land is left too long under the Nigerian sun, it hardens like fired stone. It loses moisture, loses life, loses hope. Abina lay in bed hearing reports that plot after plot was drying out, and it burned through him like fire. He considered hiring men from another village. The cost was too high. He thought about selling off some livestock to raise money. But after treatment, medicine, and old business debts still unpaid, the money in the house was no longer as comfortable as he had imagined. For the first time in years, he was forced to calculate like a man running out of breath. Every afternoon, from the window of his room, he stared out at the distant fields. The land lay there, still and yellow beneath the sun, like a body dying of thirst. The furrows from the previous season were now being overtaken by weeds. A few birds pecked at the edges of the ridges and then flew away. The sight left him restless and sleepless. More than anyone, he understood that if this season was lost, the damage would not stop at one corn harvest. It would bring debt, disgrace, and the collapse of the image he had worked so hard to build, the image of the richest man in the region. And yet each time he tried to shout at someone to go work the field in his place, the silence in return grew thicker. People were no longer that afraid of him. The accident had broken his leg. But what cracked even more deeply was the power he had once believed could never be taken away. During those days, Baba Chinedu lived more quietly than ever. After the fateful collapse, his body grew noticeably weaker. His shoulders still ached whenever he moved too much. The marks on his neck no longer bled, but they remained on his skin like a reminder that would never fully fade. He walked more slowly, coughed more often, and spent long stretches sitting on the porch at dusk, staring out toward the fields without saying a word. He did not enter Abina's room often, nor did he ask many questions. If he happened to see his son limping through the yard on crutches, he would simply turn away in silence. Between them there were no longer the violent shouting matches of before, but neither was there any easy bridge left to reconnect them. In that house, silence had become heavier than any whip. Then the season truly arrived. It waited for no one. One morning, the last remaining leader of the hired workers came to the yard, scratching his head and avoiding Abina's eyes. "We can take the work anymore," he said quietly. "People in the village are talking too much. And besides, you can afford the wages this time." Abina tightened his grip on the arm of his chair. "Get out." The man lowered his head and walked away. The sound of his footsteps fading into the distance sounded like the final closing of something. That day, Abina sat alone for a long time. The heat was suffocating. Sweat ran down the back of his neck even though he was doing nothing. Out there, the fields lay motionless, broad and defiant, like a mockery. He had never imagined he would be cornered like this. There had once been a time when one tilt of his chin sent people running after him. There had once been a time when he stood in the field, whip in hand, believing he held power over the land, the harvest, even over his own father. But now, one broken leg was enough to drag him from that height back down to the dust. By evening, he took his crutches and made his way to the storage shed. In the dark corner, the old wooden yoke was still there. The old rope, the old plow. Everything lay there covered in dust, silent as if it had been waiting for this very day. Abina stood there staring for a long time. The last light of day slipped through the cracks in the wall, falling across the rough wood, the frayed rope, the dull plow blade. A chill ran down his spine, even though the air was still sweltering. In his mind flashed the image of Baba Chinadu dragging himself forward beneath that same yoke. He immediately wanted to drive it away. But the more he tried to push it out, the clearer it became. The sound of his own voice shouting, the crack of the whip, the bent back, the old feet sinking into mud. That night, Abina barely slept. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he did something that a few months earlier, even he would never have believed. He dragged the plow out into the yard. The scrape of wood across the ground made Baba Chainidu, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the porch, lift his head slightly. He did not ask a question. He only watched. Abina avoided his eyes. He held the yoke in both hands. His broken leg had not yet healed, and every step sent pain stabbing through him. He clenched his teeth, sweat already rising on his skin, even though he had only carried the heavy thing a few steps. By the time he reached the edge of the field, he had to stop and breathe hard, as if he had already walked miles. The field in the early morning was strangely quiet. A few villagers saw him and immediately paused. They said nothing, but their eyes lingered. News spread faster than the wind. In just a short while, several figures were standing in the distance beneath the trees, pretending to do other things while in truth watching Abina's field. He knew they were watching. That alone made his hands shake. But the field before him did not care about his pride. The earth needed to be plowed. The season would not wait, and no one was coming to save a man who had once turned another human being into a beast of labor. At last, in the suffocating silence of that morning, Abina did the very thing he had once believed all his life he would only ever stand and watch others do. He tied the rope around his own neck. The coarse rope touched his skin, scraped, and tightened. Not too tightly, but enough for him to feel instantly the discomfort, the humiliation, the stripping away of dignity that he had never once cared to think about when he had looped it around his father's neck. He placed the yoke on his shoulders. The heavy block of wood pressed down on both shoulder blades, landing against muscles already worn out from weeks of using crutches. His injured leg buckled slightly, and he nearly lost his balance. A sharp pain shot from the broken leg all the way to his hip. In that instant, Abina understood that the yoke was not heavy only because it was made of wood. It was also heavy with humiliation. He stood there for a long time, unable to take the first step. The sun rose higher. Golden light spread across the field. The people standing in the distance continued to watch in silence. Then Abina lowered his head and pulled. The plow jerked as if the earth itself were refusing to move. He strained with his whole body once more. The muscles in his neck stood out. Pain shot through his shoulders. His good foot dug hard into the soil, while the injured leg dragged behind in a crooked, desperate motion. At last, the plow blade shifted and cut the first line across the field. Just one line, and he was already breathing as if he might collapse. Every step after that tore through him with pain. His broken leg had not fully healed, so every moment of weight-bearing sent agony shooting into his skull. His shoulders quickly went numb beneath the yoke's weight, then burned. The rope at his throat bit into his skin, making every breath short and shallow. Sweat ran into his eyes. Mud clung to his pant legs, to his feet, even to the injured leg, making every movement harder. But what tormented him most was not only the physical pain. It was the feeling of being lowered, humiliated, broken in this very field. This was the place where he had once stood upright like a petty king, whip in hand, watching his father bend beneath the earth and sky. This was the place where he had shouted orders, insulted him, trampled filial duty as casually as mud. And now here too, every silent stare from the distance fell on his back like questions that did not need to be spoken aloud. How does it feel now? Do you understand now? Abina did not dare turn around to look at anyone. He only kept his head down and pulled. Pulled like a man driven to the edge. Pulled like a man repaying a debt he had once thought he could escape forever. At the edge of the field, Baba Chinadu had appeared at some point. He stood beneath the thin shade of a low palm tree, leaning on an old bamboo cane. The morning breeze stirred the faded hem of his shirt. His old face was still hollow, his shoulders still thin, and the marks of months of abuse were still there. He watched his son drag the plow across the soil without saying a single word. No curse, no mockery, no satisfaction. That silence was what disturbed Abina most of all. If Baba Chinadu had shouted, if he had smiled bitterly, if he had said something cruel, perhaps Abina would have found it easier to bear. At least then he could have turned his humiliation into anger. But the old man only stood there, watching in silence, with the deep, tired eyes of someone who had gone through too much pain to still be interested in revenge. That silence was like a mirror. It forced Abina to look straight at himself. The first furrow was finished. Then the second. The more he pulled, the more his body gave way. His injured leg trembled violently. His breathing became ragged. His throat dried out as though filled with sand. His shoulders went numb, then flamed with pain. At times he thought he could hear the echo of his own voice from past days rising back across the empty field. "Faster! Keep it straight! You were useless!" Each phrase now sounded like a lash striking back across his own flesh. By midday, the sun had risen higher. The air grew thick and hot. Even the birds had gone to hide. The field reflected the heat back into his face like a furnace. Abina tried to drag the plow a few more steps, but his vision began to blur. The pain in his leg rose in waves, like a hammer striking from inside the bone outward. His shoulders slipped under the yoke. The rope at his throat tightened harder as he lost rhythm. He clenched his teeth, trying to stay upright, trying to prove to the invisible crowd that he could still endure, trying to prove to his father that life had not completely broken him. But the body does not obey pride. One more step, then half a step more. His injured leg gave out first. The plow dragged sideways. His entire body pitched forward. And then he fell. In the very field where he had once stood like a ruler. The fall was not dramatic, not loud like a performance, but it carried the weight of an entire cycle of retribution closing shut. His face hit the hot soil. The wooden yoke slipped from his shoulders and fell beside him. The rope still hung around his neck. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook violently, and his leg felt as though it were breaking all over again. A groan escaped him, hoarse and helpless. No one ran to him right away. The people standing at a distance only fell silent, because this time, the scene before them looked too much like the one they had once watched Baba Chinju endure, except now the positions had changed. Abina lay there, chest heaving, his breath broken. Dirt covered his face. Sweat mixed with mud in messy streaks. There was nothing left of the image of the richest man in the region. No authority, no coldness, no stare that could silence others. Only a man tasting in full the physical pain and spiritual humiliation he had once sown into someone else's life. From the edge of the field, Baba Chinadu slowly walked a few steps closer. His bamboo cane tapped softly against the earth. Then he stopped not far from his son. Abina lay on his side and looked up at him. For the first time in a very long while, there was no command left in his eyes. Only something he had forgotten how to carry for many years. The weakness of a human being in pain. Baba Chinadu still said nothing, but his eyes no longer seemed entirely distant. There was weariness in them, and pain and wounds not yet healed. And very deep inside there was also the sadness of a father watching his son finally be taught by life through the very thing he had once inflicted on others. A light breeze swept across the field. The plow lay still. The yoke lay tilted in the mud. The sun riffed on the hot ground. The old father stood there, silent, like a witness to justice that needed no words. On that sun-drenched field in Nigeria, no one needed to speak to name what was happening, because there are days when life does not need a courtroom. It only needs to return people to the very place they once forced others into. Abina still lay there in the middle of the field, face pressed into the burning hot earth, his chest heaving violently, as if every breath had to be wrestled back from pain itself. The wooden yoke had slipped from his shoulders and lay tilted beside him like a silent piece of evidence. The rope was still caught around his neck, coarse and humiliating. A little farther away, the plow stood half buried in the freshly turned soil, motionless under the midday sun. The vast openness of the Nigerian field had grown so still that one could hear the thin wind brushing through palm leaves, the soft rustle of dust underfoot, and even the faint groan of a man who had finally reached the bottom of himself. The people standing at a distance along the edge of the field still did not dare come closer, not because they still feared Abina the way they once had, but because there are moments in life so private, so painful, so real, that outsiders can only stand still and watch without daring to intrude. They looked at the man who had once made the whole village lower its eyes, now curled up in mud and dirt. They looked at the old father standing there with a bamboo cane in his hand, back bent, shoulders narrow, the marks around his neck not yet fully faded. And everyone understood that what was happening before their eyes was not simply a man collapsing in a field. It was the moment an arrogant soul began to crack open. Abina pressed both hands into the ground, trying to push himself up, but the instant his injured leg took any weight, his whole body trembled violently. A sharp hiss escaped through his teeth. He collapsed again. Mud clung to his arms, smeared across his cheek, his forehead, and the part of his neck rubbed raw by the rope. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out the pain tearing through every muscle. But the tighter he shut them, the more clearly he saw the things he had spent so long refusing to see. He saw Baba Chainiju again in those dark early mornings. He saw the old bent back bowed beneath the wooden yoke. He saw his father's feet sinking into the mud, trembling, yet still moving. He saw himself standing behind him, upright and cold-faced, lashing the air with cruel commands, as though the man before him were not his father at all, but merely a breathing force of labor. He heard his own voice again, sharp as a blade. "Keep it straight. Faster. You were useless." Every sentence, every word, every sound no longer echoed like power. It echoed like an accusation. Abina opened his eyes, but the field before him still swayed. Sunlight covered the land in a harsh white glare that made everything look both brutally clear and strangely blurred at the same time. And through that light, he saw his father's aged feet slowly stepping closer. Baba Chaindu came forward one step at a time. The bamboo cane touched the dry earth with soft, slow knocks. His walk was still weak. His shoulders still leaned slightly from the months of suffering beneath the yoke. Every step he took was living proof of what Abina had done to him, and yet he kept walking forward. Not in a hurry, not in anger, not with the eyes of a man coming to take revenge. Just a frail old father moving toward the son who had collapsed in the very place where he had once driven his father to the edge of destruction. Obina looked at him, and a strange feeling rose in his chest. First came fear, then shame, then something deeper than the pain in his broken leg or the numbness in his shoulders. It was the moment he understood that there was nowhere left for him to hide from the truth. Money could not save him from this pain. Power could not lift him back to his feet. Pride could not help him plow even one more furrow. And the only person still walking toward him as he lay in the mud, disgraced like this, was the very man he had once treated worse than an animal. Abina's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, but his lips only trembled. It had been a very long time since he had used his voice to say anything soft. He was used to giving orders, used to forcing his will on others, used to using words like a whip. And now, faced with having to speak the truest thing inside him, he suddenly felt as helpless as a lost child with no one left to guide him. Baba Chainadu stopped in front of him. He stood under the sun, his shadow falling short across the hot ground. His old face was carved with the marks of years, of poverty, of sacrifice, of endurance, and of the pain he had suffered in this very field. His eyes looked down at his son, not cold, not bitter, only sad, a deep, quiet sadness, like water that has endured too many storms to rise into waves anymore. And that look struck Abina down harder than any pain in his body. For the first time, tears fell from his face. Not just a few drops, clinging to the corners of his eyes to preserve his pride, but real tears, hot, unstoppable tears rolling down through the dust on his cheeks, leaving long, blurred streaks behind. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. A sob broke from his chest as if something inside him had finally shattered completely. "Father." That one word alone made the people standing far away go still, because it was the first time in so long that Abina had called the man before him by the sacred name he himself had thrown away. His voice broke, hoarse and twisted with tears and pain. "Father, I'm sorry." No one answered at once. The wind moved across the field, stirring the faded hem of Baba Chainadu's old shirt, trembling the thin grasses along the edge of the land, and making the rope on the ground shift slightly like some dead creature. Abina bowed his head even lower, his shoulders hunched in on themselves. He no longer looked like the man who had once terrified the entire village. At that moment, he looked only like a son who had matured far too late, kneeling in the middle of the consequences of his own actions, finally learning to hurt because of what he had done. "I'm sorry," he repeated, more quietly, as if speaking to the earth, to the sun, to his father, and to the part of himself he had lost over the years. I didn't know what I had become. I thought money made me strong. I thought that because you were old and weak, you were only a burden. I forgot everything." His voice broke off. He could not continue, because to name all his sins, it would have taken more than a single afternoon in that field. Baba Chainadu listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask more questions. He did not use silence to shame his son further. He simply stood there, like an old tree that had endured too much sun and wind, quietly listening to the late collapse of the very seed he had spent his whole life trying to nurture. Then slowly, very slowly, he planted his bamboo cane into the ground and bent down. That movement was far harder than it looked. Outsiders could not see all of it, but every muscle in his shoulders still carried pain. His back still throbbed whenever he bent low. His knees were still weak after the long months of dragging himself beneath that yoke, and yet he still bent down. Still reached out his trembling hands toward his son. Those hands were thin, calloused, veined, their skin wrinkled by sun, wind, and labor. But when they touched Abinna's arm, they were still warm, a strange warmth, an old warmth, a real warmth. The warmth of the man who had carried him as a child, who had once held his hand as he learned to walk across the dirt yard, who had gone hungry so he could have a chance to study, who had stood at the dusty bus station and watched him leave the village with a lifetime of hope. Baba Chinidu helped his son up. Abinna clenched his teeth, collapsing to one side from the pain in his leg. But this time he was not struggling alone. His father's arm held him weak, yet steady, a strength that did not come from muscle, but from the kind of love that had been beaten and buried so deeply it seemed dead, and yet was still glowing faintly beneath the ashes. When Abinna managed to stand, even though it was awkward and crooked, and he leaned more on his father than on himself, he suddenly broke down crying even harder. These were no longer tears of physical pain. They were the tears of a man who had finally understood that he had treated the person who loved him most with the greatest cruelty. He lowered his head, unable to look his father in the eye. Baba Chinedu waited until his breathing settled a little. Then he spoke, not at length, not harshly, not like a sermon, just one sentence, very soft, very slow, but it passed through every sound of wind, heartbeat, pain and shame still lingering over that field. My son, do you understand now? That question was not only about the yoke, not only about the rope, not only about the pain of a broken leg or the humiliation of pulling a plow through the field. It asked about everything. Do you understand what it means to be a father? Do you understand what it means to be brought low? Do you understand what it means for an old body to keep enduring only because of love? Do you understand how a person can lose his soul when he begins to treat gratitude as something no longer necessary? And do you understand what it means to be too late yet not so late that you cannot still begin again? Obinna looked up. For the first time in a long while, he looked straight into his father's eyes without pride or irritation. There were only tears, only naked remorse, only the pain of a late awakening that was finally real. He nodded, a trembling nod, soaked in tears. Yes, I understand now. Those 4 words came out so quietly they sounded almost pitiful. But to Baba Chinedu, perhaps it was the first time after many months of hell that he had heard the voice of the little boy he once knew still hiding somewhere inside the man before him. The wind moved across the field. The plow lay still on the earth. The wooden yoke lay tilted, no longer pressing on anyone's shoulders. The rope lay coiled in the red dust like a symbol of the cruelty that had just been exposed and stripped bare. Far away, the villagers standing along the edge of the field did not say a word, but their faces were different now, no longer only curious or judgmental. In their eyes there was now emotion and also a deep reflection, because they all understood they had just witnessed something rarer than an accident, rarer even than punishment. They had witnessed a heart as hard as stone beginning to feel pain for what was right. Abinna still leaned on his father. That frail old man could no longer lift a strong body the way he once might have, yet he was still doing the one thing only parents know how to do, holding up their child at the very moment the child sees his own ugliness most clearly. And in that moment, Obinna understood that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting wounds. Forgiveness is when the one who was hurt still chooses not to push you deeper into your fall. That is the greatest debt in a human life. They stood in the field for a long time. No one said anything more. There was no need, because some lessons, once learned through flesh, tears, humiliation, and pain, cannot be made any deeper by words. From that day on, the people in the village began to see a different Abinna, not a change that happened instantly like a fairy tale. There was no miracle in which he became a perfect man overnight. His legs still hurt. His old temper still surfaced at times. Shame still followed him like a shadow. But one thing had changed at the root. He no longer stood above his father. He helped his father sit down every afternoon. He cleaned the yoke himself and put it away in storage, not to use it again, but as if he were burying a filthy part of his own past. He hired workers to repair his father's sold roof, but this time not to show off his wealth, only to make amends. He learned to listen for his father's coughing, learned to prepare medicine, learned to walk slowly while helping him across the yard, learned to say, "Father," without feeling the word heavy in his mouth. Some nights, Abina sat alone on the porch, looking at the field lying silent in the darkness, remembering the day he had dragged the plow with his damaged body and fallen in the hot earth. And every time he remembered it, he heard his father's words echo inside him. "My son, do you understand now?" And every time, the answer was the same. "Yes, I understand. I understand too late, which is why it hurts even more. But it is still not too late to live differently." As for Baba Chinidu, he never brought up the past again. Not because he forgot. Those who have truly suffered never forget completely. He simply chose to let that pain stop with his own generation, instead of turning it into a new whip to strike back at the son who had finally learned to repent. That is a kind of nobility only hearts that have been shattered but never turned poisonous can possess. The next season, the field turned green again. There was no longer the sight of an old father with a rope around his neck. No longer the shadow of a son standing behind the plow with cold eyes. Only the wind moving through the trees, the sun rising over the countryside of Nigeria, and a man whose leg would never be fully whole again, but who had finally begun to learn how to before what is right. Because sometimes, a person may lose money, lose status, lose pride, even lose the very things he once believed were strength. And only from that place of loss do they begin to learn how to be human. And in the field that had once witnessed both cruelty and consequence, the final lesson that remained was not the pain of the man who had been punished. It was the mercy of a father, great enough to save the last piece of humanity still left inside the son who had once hurt him most. There are some lessons in life that cannot be learned through words alone. Not everyone can understand pain just by hearing about it. Not everyone can recognize their mistakes just because they were given advice. Only when you are forced to live inside someone else's pain, when you feel every heavy step, every lingering wound, every moment of suffering with no one there to defend you, only then do you truly understand how deeply wrong you have been. Life does not rush to punish, but it always remembers. And one day, it will place you in the very position you once forced someone else into, not to destroy you, but to awaken you. So if today you still have the chance, if your parents are still by your side, if you still have time to make things right, don't wait until they are gone before you begin to regret. Love them while you still can. Cherish them while there is still time. Because the person who has endured the most from you in this life is often the very person who has loved you the most. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and share it so more people can learn from this lesson. And remember, the greatest wealth a person can have is not money. It is the way they treat the people who sacrificed their whole lives for them.